Hi, and welcome to the Archive of History. Imagine standing on a plateau where the air is thin and cool, where the light falls golden across ancient stone, and where the wind carries secrets from a world that has almost been forgotten. This is the highland country of northern Ethiopia, a place where the earth rises sharply from the Red Sea coast, creating a natural fortress in the sky. Here, nearly 2,000 years ago, there stood one of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world. It was an empire that minted its own coins in gold, silver, and bronze. It commanded fleets that sailed between 3 continents. Its kings corresponded with Roman emperors and Persian shahs. Its merchants grew wealthy on the trade of frankincense, myrrh, ivory, and exotic spices. And yet, for most of modern history, this great empire was lost to memory, buried beneath the dust of centuries. Its monuments silent, its inscriptions unread. This is the story of Axum, the forgotten empire that once stood as a bridge between Africa, Arabia, and the Mediterranean world. Tonight you will walk through its crowded markets, stand before its towering monuments, and witness the daily rhythms of a civilization that thrived for nearly 1,000 years before it slowly, mysteriously faded into legend. Before we drift off, I am always curious to know where my listeners are tuning in from and what time it is that they are listening tonight. Let me know in the comments. Now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Close your eyes and let us travel back across the centuries to a time when Axum was the jewel of the ancient world, a place of tremendous power, deep faith, and profound mystery. The story begins not with kings or conquests, but with the land itself. The Ethiopian highlands are among the most dramatic landscapes on Earth. They rise abruptly from the scorching lowlands of the Red Sea coast, climbing through successive bands of climate and vegetation until they reach altitudes of 8,000 feet and higher. Here on these high plateaus, the air is cool and clear, even when the sun blazes overhead. The soil, enriched by volcanic rock and centuries of weathering, is dark and fertile. Seasonal rains arrive with reliable regularity, nourishing fields of teff, barley, and wheat. Rivers carve deep gorges through the highlands, creating natural boundaries and defensible positions. It is a land that seems designed for agriculture, for settlement, for the slow accumulation of wealth and power, and it is isolated enough to be protected, yet connected enough to the wider world to matter. The people who would build Axum did not arrive suddenly. They were part of a long, gradual migration of Semitic-speaking peoples who crossed the Red Sea from the Arabian Peninsula over many centuries. These migrations were not invasions, but slow movements of families, clans, and small communities seeking new lands and opportunities. They brought with them their languages, their agricultural techniques, their gods, and their stories. When they arrived in the highlands, they found a landscape already inhabited by indigenous Cushitic-speaking peoples who had lived there for millennia. What followed was not conquest, but a slow process of cultural blending, intermarriage, and the creation of something new. The language that emerged, Jais, carried the grammar and structure of Semitic tongues but was spoken in a land of African traditions and beliefs. The society that formed was neither purely Arabian nor purely African, but a synthesis, a hybrid culture that would become uniquely Ethiopian. In the centuries before Axum rose to prominence, the highlands were dotted with small kingdoms and chiefdoms. These were agricultural societies, organized around kinship and clan loyalty, ruled by local chiefs, who controlled the best farmland and the strategic mountain passes. Their wealth came from the land, from the harvest, and from the herds of cattle that grazed on the high plateaus. But their future prosperity would come from something else entirely, something that required not just fertile soil but strategic geography. The highlands sat at the crossroads of 2 great trade networks. To the west lay the vast interior of Africa, with its gold, ivory, and enslaved peoples. To the east lay the Red Sea, the ancient highway connecting the Mediterranean world with the Indian Ocean. And directly to the north, just a few days' journey down from the mountains, lay the coastal plain and the great natural harbor that would become known as Adulis. Control of this harbor and the trade routes that flowed through it would transform a collection of highland villages into an empire. The rise of Axum, the city that would give its name to the empire, began sometime around the 1st century of the Common Era. The settlement itself was ancient, but it was during this period that it began to grow from a regional center into something far more significant. The reasons for Axum's rise are not entirely clear, lost as they are in the fragmentary historical record. But the broad outlines are visible. a dynasty of kings whose names are now mostly forgotten, established their authority over the surrounding highlands. They consolidated power, absorbed rival chiefdoms, and most importantly, they seized control of the trade route that ran from the interior to the coast. This was the key to everything. Goods flowing from the African interior, ivory, gold, rhinoceros horn, tortoiseshell, had to pass through Axumite territory to reach the port of Adulis. The kings of Axum did not produce these goods themselves, but they controlled the routes, levied the taxes, and grew rich from the passage of wealth. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Axum had become a significant regional power. Its influence extended over a large portion of the northern highlands and down to the coast. But it was not yet an empire in the full sense. That transformation would come later, driven by a combination of military ambition, economic opportunity, and religious revolution. For now, imagine Axum in these early centuries as a prosperous highland kingdom, a place where local chiefs had become kings, where mud-brick villages had grown into stone-built towns, and where the first great monuments were beginning to rise from the earth. To understand Axum at the height of its power, you must first understand its capital. The city of Axum was not merely the seat of government, it was the physical embodiment of the empire's wealth, its ambition, and its connection to the divine. Even today, after centuries of abandonment and decline, the ruins of Axum are staggering in their scale and mystery. Imagine, then, what it must have been like in the 4th or 5th century, when the empire was at its zenith, when the city was alive with activity, when its monuments were new and its power was unquestioned. You approach the city from the east, following the ancient trade route that winds up from the coast. The journey has taken you days, climbing steadily from the hot, arid lowlands into the cool, green highlands. As you crest the final ridge, the city spreads before you. The first thing you see, visible from miles away, are the great stelae. These are massive stone obelisks, carved from single pieces of granite, rising hundreds of feet into the sky. They are not natural formations, but monuments, created by human hands with an almost impossible degree of skill and ambition. The largest of them, now fallen and broken, was once over 100 feet tall, weighing hundreds of tons. It was carved to resemble a multi-story building, with false doors and windows etched into its surface, a stone tower reaching toward the heavens. These stelae served as royal grave markers, memorials to the kings and queens of Axum, declarations of power that could be seen from every direction. As you enter the city, the streets are busy. This is a place of perhaps 20 or 30,000 inhabitants at its peak, making it one of the largest cities in the ancient world beyond the Mediterranean. The houses are built of stone, not the mud brick common in most African settlements, but carefully cut and fitted masonry. The wealthier homes have multiple stories, with wooden balconies and thatched roofs. The air is filled with the sounds of daily life, the lowing of cattle being driven to market, the rhythmic pounding of grain being milled, the chatter of merchants haggling over prices, and the distant chanting from one of the city's many churches. The smell of wood smoke hangs in the air, mixed with the earthy scent of teff bread baking and the pungent aroma of berbere spice. The heart of the city is the palace complex. This is not a single building, but a sprawling series of structures built on a raised platform of earth and stone. The main palace is a massive rectangular building, several stories tall, with thick stone walls and narrow windows. Inside, the rooms are cool and dim, lit by oil lamps and shafts of sunlight filtering through high openings. The floors are paved with stone slabs, and the walls are plastered and whitewashed. In the largest hall, the throne room, the king receives visitors and conducts the business of empire. The throne itself is carved wood, inlaid with ivory and precious metals, and draped with rich textiles imported from India and Egypt. Around the throne stand the officials of the court, men dressed in fine cotton robes, their wrists and necks adorned with gold and silver jewelry. They speak in low voices, conducting the endless administrative work of governance, receiving reports from distant provinces, adjudicating disputes, and planning military campaigns. Surrounding the palace are the homes of the nobility, the wealthy merchants and the high officials of the state. These are substantial stone buildings, often 2 or 3 stories high, with interior courtyards where families gather in the cool of the evening. The courtyards are planted with small gardens, where herbs and vegetables grow in raised beds, and where a single tree, perhaps a juniper or a fig, provides shade. The wealthier families employ servants, men and women from the surrounding countryside who have come to the city seeking work. These servants prepare meals, tend to the household, and carry water from the city's wells. Life in these homes is comfortable by the standards of the ancient world. There is enough to eat, the rooms are spacious and well built, and the family's wealth is evident in the fine pottery, the bronze lamps, and the woven baskets that fill the storage rooms. Beyond the elite quarter, the city spreads outward in a less orderly fashion. Here are the homes of artisans, traders and laborers, smaller structures built close together along narrow lanes. The workshops of potters, metalworkers and weavers line the streets, their doors open to the air, the sounds of hammering and the whir of looms creating a constant background hum. Children play in the streets, chasing each other between the buildings, their laughter bright against the steady rhythm of adult work. At the edge of the city, near the fields that surround it, are the simpler homes of farmers who work the land just outside the walls. These are one-room structures, with walls of stone or wattle and daub, and roofs of thatch. Inside, the space is divided by function, with sleeping areas on raised platforms, a central hearth for cooking and storage jars for grain and oil lined against the walls. And then there are the monuments. Scattered throughout Axum are dozens of stelae, smaller than the giants near the city center, but still impressive, standing 10 or 20 feet tall. There are stone thrones, massive carved seats where kings once sat in judgment, now weathered and worn but still imposing. There are the remains of large water reservoirs, stone-lined pools that collected rainwater and supplied the city during the dry season. And most striking of all, there are the ruins of great stone platforms, the foundations of buildings long since vanished, their purpose now unclear, but their scale suggesting structures of tremendous importance. The construction techniques that made these structures possible reveal much about Axumite engineering prowess. The building stone was primarily granite and basalt, hard volcanic rocks that were abundant in the highlands. Quarrying these stones was itself a major undertaking. Workers would identify suitable rock faces, then use a technique of controlled fracturing to separate blocks from the living rock. This involved drilling a series of holes along the desired break line, then inserting wooden wedges into the holes. The wedges would be soaked with water, causing them to expand and create enormous pressure. Over hours or days, this pressure would force cracks to propagate through the stone, eventually separating a large block from the cliff face. Once quarried, these blocks, some weighing many tons, had to be transported to the construction site. This required sophisticated understanding of mechanics and enormous labor resources. The blocks were likely moved on wooden rollers or sledges, pulled by teams of oxen or by human workers using ropes. The terrain between quarries and the city was often rough, requiring the construction of temporary roads or ramps. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of the largest stones were moved over distances of several miles, a feat that required careful planning and coordination of hundreds of workers. The actual construction process demonstrated remarkable precision. Axumite builders used a distinctive technique known as monkey head construction, where wooden beam ends protruded from stone walls at regular intervals. These beams served multiple purposes. They acted as scaffolding during construction, allowing workers to climb and work at height. They helped bind the structure together, with horizontal wooden beams connecting vertical stone elements. And they may have provided some flexibility during earthquakes, allowing the building to absorb shocks without collapsing entirely. This technique is still visible in many Axumite ruins, where the wooden beams have long since rotted away, leaving characteristic square holes in the stonework. The stonework itself was sophisticated. Blocks were cut and dressed to fit tightly together, often without the use of mortar. The masons used bronze and iron tools, chisels and hammers to shape the stones. The level of precision achieved is impressive. Many joints between stones are so tight that even today, after centuries of weathering, you cannot insert a knife blade between them. This precision required not just skill but also careful planning and measurement. Axumite architects understood principles of proportion and symmetry, creating buildings that were not only functional but also aesthetically pleasing. The interior spaces of elite buildings were often plastered and whitewashed, creating smooth, light-colored surfaces that reflected the limited light from small windows. The floors were sometimes paved with carefully fitted stone slabs, or they might be finished with compacted clay mixed with lime to create a hard, smooth surface. Ceilings were typically constructed of wooden beams supporting thatch or clay tiles. In the most prestigious buildings, the wooden beams might be carved with decorative patterns or painted with pigments made from local minerals. Water management was another area where Axumite engineering excelled. The seasonal nature of the highland rains meant that water had to be carefully collected and stored during the wet season to supply the city during the dry months. The Axumites constructed large stone-lined reservoirs, some of them holding thousands of cubic meters of water. These reservoirs were fed by channels that collected runoff from roofs and paved surfaces, directing it into the storage pools. The channels were carefully graded to ensure proper flow, and they included sedimentation basins where suspended soil could settle out before the water reached the main reservoir. The water distribution system was equally sophisticated. From the reservoirs, stone channels carried water to different parts of the city. Some of these channels were covered to prevent evaporation and contamination. Wells, dug deep into the ground to reach underground water sources, supplemented the surface storage. The well shafts were lined with stone to prevent collapse, and the water was raised using leather buckets on ropes, a labor-intensive but effective method. Public fountains and watering troughs were located at convenient points throughout the city, serving both the human population and the many animals that lived in or passed through Axum. Drainage was equally important. Without proper drainage, the heavy rains of the wet season could quickly turn streets into rivers and undermine building foundations. The Axumites built stone-lined drains that ran along the sides of streets, collecting rainwater and wastewater and channeling it away from inhabited areas. These drains emptied into natural watercourses or into areas designated for disposal outside the city. The sophistication of this infrastructure speaks to a government that had the resources and the foresight to invest in public works that improved the quality of urban life. The stelae, in particular, demand attention. To stand before one of these monuments is to be confronted with a mystery. How were they carved? The stone is granite, one of the hardest materials known, and yet each stelae is covered with intricate detail, false doors and windows, decorative bands and inscriptions. The inscriptions are written in stelaes, the language of the empire, using a script that flows in elegant geometric characters. Some of the inscriptions are dedications to kings, listing their victories and their piety. Others are religious invocations, calling on the protection of the gods, or in later centuries, on the Christian God. The stelae were carved in quarries miles from the city, then transported over rough terrain and erected using methods that remain debated by scholars. Some suggest massive wooden scaffolds and hundreds of laborers pulling on ropes. Others point to the use of levers and counterweights. Whatever the method, the result is undeniable. These monuments were expressions of power, declarations that the kings of Axum commanded the resources, the labor, and the ambition to create something permanent, something that would outlast flesh and blood. Walking through Axum in its prime, you would have sensed not just wealth, but confidence. This was a city that saw itself as the equal of Rome, of Persia, of any power in the known world. And in many ways it was. For the source of Axum's power was not just agriculture or military might, it was trade, the movement of goods across vast distances, the transformation of raw materials into wealth, and the strategic control of the routes that connected continents. The port of Adulis lies a week's journey to the northeast of Axum, down from the highlands to the Red Sea coast. If Axum was the heart of the empire, Adulis was its lifeline, the place where the wealth of Africa met the merchants of the world. To reach Adulis, you descend through a landscape that changes dramatically with each mile. The cool green highlands give way to dry scrubland, then to barren rock and sand, until finally you emerge onto the coastal plain, where the heat is intense and the air shimmers with humidity. The sea, when it comes into view, is a deep, startling blue, its surface glittering under the relentless sun. The journey down from the highlands is itself an experience of transformation. You begin in the morning coolness of Axum, the air crisp and thin. The road, such as it is, follows ancient paths worn by generations of traders and their pack animals. As you descend, the vegetation changes. The fields of teff and barley give way to scattered acacia trees, their thorny branches spreading wide. The temperature rises with each mile, the sun growing stronger, the air growing heavier. By midday, the heat is oppressive. Travelers wrap their heads in cloth to protect against the sun, and they move slowly, conserving energy. Water becomes the most precious commodity. Caravans plan their routes carefully, knowing where the wells and springs are, timing their travel to reach these sources before the water skins run dry. The road passes through small villages and way stations, places where travelers can rest, where animals can be fed and watered, where guards and guides can be hired for the most dangerous stretches. These settlements survive on the caravan trade, selling food and fodder, offering shelter for the night. The people here speak different languages, a mix of highland jazz and lowland tongues, and they move between worlds, familiar with both the cool mountains and the hot coast. At night, the caravans camp in the open, circling their animals for protection, lighting fires to ward off predators and to provide light. The stars in the lowland sky are brilliant, uncountable, and the air is filled with the sounds of insects and the occasional distant roar of a predator. As the journey continues, the landscape becomes increasingly harsh. The scrubland gives way to desert, to stretches of sand and rock where nothing grows. The heat here is brutal, reflecting off the pale stones, making the air waver. Mirages appear on the horizon, false promises of water that vanish as you approach. The final approach to Adulis brings relief. The smell of the sea reaches you before you see it, a briny, living scent that speaks of moisture and vastness. And then, cresting a final rise, the Red Sea spreads before you, impossibly blue, impossibly wide, a world entirely different from the mountains you left behind. Adulis itself is not beautiful. It is a working port, a place built for commerce rather than grandeur. The harbor is natural, a sheltered bay protected from the worst of the Red Sea's storms by a curve of rocky land. The waterfront is lined with wooden piers and stone quays, where ships from across the ancient world tie up to unload their cargoes. On any given day you might see vessels from Roman Egypt, their square sails furled, their hulls low in the water with goods. There are Arab dhows from the southern coast of Arabia, their triangular sails distinctive against the sky. There are Indian ships, larger and more heavily built, their crews speaking languages incomprehensible to most of the people on the docks. And there are local vessels, smaller boats that ply the coastal trade, carrying goods from one Red Sea port to another. The docks are a chaos of activity. Longshoremen, many of them stripped to the waist in the heat, haul bales and crates from the ships. Their bodies glisten with sweat, their muscles straining under the weight of the cargo. They work in teams, moving to rhythms called out by a foreman, their movements synchronized. The pier itself is slick with spilled water and fish oil, and the footing is treacherous. Gulls wheel overhead, their cries piercing, diving occasionally to snatch scraps from the water or from careless workers. The smell is overwhelming, a mixture of salt, tar, fish, spices, and human sweat, all baking in the fierce coastal heat. Merchants stand in clusters, examining goods, arguing over prices, and negotiating terms through interpreters. These men are cosmopolitan, fluent in multiple languages, experienced in the ways of international trade. They dress according to their origins. The Egyptians wear linen robes, lightweight and practical in the heat. The Indians are draped in fine cotton, often dyed in brilliant colors. The Arabs wear flowing garments and head coverings that protect against sun and sand. And the Axumites, the local merchants and officials, wear a mix of styles, some adopting foreign dress for business, others maintaining traditional highland clothing despite the heat. The negotiations are complex, involving not just price but also questions of quality, delivery, and trust. A merchant might spend days inspecting a cargo, testing the weight of ivory tusks, smelling frankincense to judge its purity, examining textiles for flaws. The goods themselves are staggering in their variety. From the African interior come elephant tusks, some as long as a man is tall, stacked in careful rows. There are bundles of animal hides, leopard and lion skins destined for wealthy homes in Rome. There are bars of raw gold, dust and small nuggets, carefully weighed and recorded by scribes. There are sacks of frankincense and myrrh, the aromatic resins that flow like tears from trees in the arid lands to the south. Resins that will be burned in temples and wealthy homes across the Mediterranean. And there are enslaved people, men, women and children captured in raids or sold by their own communities, standing in silent groups, waiting to be loaded onto ships bound for distant markets. The sight of these human cargoes is one of the grimmer aspects of the trade, a reminder that not all commerce is benign, that wealth is often built on suffering. In return for these African goods, the ships bring the products of the wider world. From Rome and Egypt come glass vessels, delicate and beautiful, wrapped carefully in straw. These are luxury items, prized for their translucency and color. There are amphorae of wine and olive oil, foodstuffs that do not grow in the highlands. There are bolts of fine cloth, linen from Egypt and silk from China, which has traveled overland along the great trade routes of Asia. The silk is especially valuable, softer and more lustrous than any fabric produced locally, and it is reserved for the wealthy elite. From India come spices, black pepper and ginger, as well as cotton textiles and beads of carnelian and glass. The Indian textiles are finely woven, often decorated with intricate patterns, and they are in high demand. From Arabia comes incense of a different kind, as well as horses, prized for their speed and stamina, animals that do not breed well in the highlands. All of this flows through Adolis, and a portion of it, a tax, a toll, a percentage, stays in the hands of the Axumite authorities. The warehouses of Adolis are vast structures, built of stone and timber, their interiors cool and dark, protected from the sun. Here, goods are stored awaiting transport inland, or loading onto ships. The warehouses are guarded day and night, for the wealth they contain is enormous. Scribes work in small offices attached to the warehouses, maintaining detailed records of every transaction. These records, written on papyrus or parchment, document the ebb and flow of commerce, the arrival and departure of ships, the names of merchants, the quantities of goods and the taxes paid. The administrative apparatus required to manage this trade is complex and efficient, a testament to the sophistication of the Axumite state. The officials who oversee this trade are among the most important people in the empire. They maintain records written in gaze on papyrus or parchment, documenting every transaction. They enforce the king's regulations, ensuring that certain goods are reserved for the royal household, that foreign merchants pay their dues, and that the flow of trade remains orderly and profitable. These officials are literate, numerate, and often multilingual, able to negotiate in Greek with Roman merchants, in Arabic with traders from Arabia, and in various African languages with those bringing goods from the interior. Their work is the engine of the empire's wealth. The wealth that flows through Adolis does not stay at the coast. It is transported inland, up the steep roads to Axum, carried by caravans of pack animals, camels in the lowlands and donkeys as the terrain grows steeper. These caravans are not small. A single shipment might require dozens of animals, each laden with goods, accompanied by armed guards to protect against bandits. The journey takes a week or more, and when the caravan finally arrives in Axum, the goods are unloaded and distributed. Some go to the royal treasury, tribute to the king. Some go to wealthy merchants who have financed the trade, and some are passed on to craftsmen and artisans, who will transform raw materials into finished goods, ivory into carved ornaments, gold into jewelry, hides into leather goods. This system of trade made Axum rich, but it also made it cosmopolitan. The city was not isolated or insular. It was a place where cultures met and mingled. Greek was spoken in the marketplaces alongside Gypsy. Roman coins circulated freely, and Axumite kings minted their own coins in imitation of Roman styles, stamped with their portraits and inscriptions in Greek and Gypsy. Foreign merchants established communities in the city, living there for months or years at a time, marrying local women, and raising children who were neither fully foreign nor fully Axumite. The result was a society that was open to new ideas, new technologies, and new beliefs. And it was this openness that would lead to the most profound transformation in Axumite history, the arrival of Christianity. Before Christianity came to Axum, the religion of the highlands was a complex blend of beliefs. The people worshipped a pantheon of gods, deities associated with the sun, the moon, the earth, and the sky. The chief god was Marem, a war god who protected the king and the army, often depicted as a warrior with a spear. There were also local spirits and ancestors, honored with offerings and sacrifices. Religious practice was not centralized. There were no great temples in the sense of the Egyptian or Roman world. Instead, worship took place at sacred groves, at stone altars, and in household shrines. The king himself was seen as a mediator between the human and divine worlds, performing rituals to ensure the fertility of the land, the success of the harvest, and victory in war. This religious system was flexible and inclusive, easily absorbing new deities and practices as the empire expanded and came into contact with other cultures. The arrival of Christianity in Axum is shrouded in legend, but the broad outlines of the story are preserved in later chronicles. In the early 4th century, during the reign of King Ezana, 2 young men from the Roman Empire were shipwrecked on the Red Sea coast. Their names were Frumentius and Adesius, and they were Christians, educated men who had been traveling with a merchant or scholar. The local authorities brought them to the court at Axum, where they became slaves or servants in the royal household. Over time, they gained the trust of the king and his family, particularly the young prince who would become Azana. They taught him to read and write in Greek, exposed him to Roman culture, and most importantly, introduced him to the teachings of Christianity. When Azana ascended to the throne, sometime around the year 330, he had already been influenced by Christian ideas, but the moment of his conversion, the moment when he officially embraced the new faith, came later. The trigger, according to tradition, was a military victory. Azana had campaigned in the south, extending Axumite control over the Nile Valley and the region of Nubia. When he returned victorious, he attributed his success not to Marem or the old gods, but to the Christian God. He ordered the erection of a great stone stela, inscribed with an account of his campaign. The inscription begins with traditional invocations to Marem, but then shifts, mid-text, to praise of the Christian God. It is a remarkable document, a snapshot of a moment of religious transition, where the old and new beliefs coexist on the same stone. Azana's conversion was not merely personal, it was a state policy, a decision that would reshape the empire. He ordered the construction of churches, invited Christian clergy from the Roman Empire to come and minister to his people, and supported the translation of Christian scriptures into Ge'ez. Christianity did not spread overnight. In the countryside, the old beliefs persisted for generations, blending with the new faith in ways that would create a unique form of Ethiopian Christianity. But in Axum itself, and among the elite, Christianity took hold quickly. It became the religion of the court, the language of power, and the ideological foundation of the empire's identity. The most important church in Axum, then and now, is the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion. According to tradition, this church was built on the site of an ancient temple and became the spiritual heart of the Ethiopian Christian state. The church that stands today is not the original. That structure, built in the 4th or 5th century, has long since collapsed or been rebuilt. But the site itself remains sacred, and the legends associated with it are central to Ethiopian Christian identity. The most famous of these legends claims that the church houses the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest that, according to the Hebrew Bible, contained the tablets of the 10 Commandments. Ethiopian tradition holds that the Ark was brought to Axum by Menelik, the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, and that it has been guarded there ever since. Whether or not this claim is true, whether the Ark is real or legendary, is almost beside the point. What matters is that the people of Axum believed it, and this belief made their city not just a political capital, but a holy city, a new Jerusalem in the heart of Africa. Inside the church, the atmosphere is hushed and sacred. The walls are hung with rich textiles, embroidered with crosses and images of saints. The air is thick with the scent of incense, frankincense and myrrh, burned in elaborate bronze censers. Priests, dressed in white robes and turbans, move through the space, chanting prayers in Ge'ez, their voices echoing in the high-ceilinged hall. The liturgy is ancient, preserving forms and words that have changed little over 16 centuries. Worshippers stand for the entire service. There are no pews, swaying slightly as they listen to the chants and join in the responses. The sense of continuity, of connection to the distant past, is palpable. Christianity in Axum was not merely a matter of belief, it was also a source of power and legitimacy. Ezana and his successors styled themselves as Christian kings, defenders of the faith, and they used this identity to forge alliances with other Christian powers, particularly the Roman Empire and later the Byzantine Empire. These alliances were diplomatic and military. When the Roman Empire struggled against Persia in the east, Axum was a valuable ally, able to threaten Persian interests in southern Arabia. When Christian communities in Arabia faced persecution, Axumite kings launched military campaigns to protect them. This gave Axum a role in the great power politics of the ancient world, a seat at the table with Rome and Persia, a status that few African kingdoms ever achieved. The religious transformation also had cultural consequences. Christian Axum developed a rich tradition of religious art and manuscript illumination. Scribes copied the Gospels and the Psalms, creating beautifully decorated manuscripts on parchment, with elaborate initial letters and marginal decorations. These manuscripts are among the oldest Christian texts in the world, and they preserve a version of the Bible that is slightly different from the versions used in Europe, with additional books and unique textual variants. The tradition of icon painting also flourished, with artists creating images of Christ, Mary, and the saints, their faces stylized and serene, their clothing rendered in flat, geometric patterns. These icons were not just decorations, they were windows into the divine, objects of veneration and prayer. But the conversion to Christianity did not mean the end of Axum's connections to the wider world. If anything, it deepened them. Christian Axum maintained its trade with the Roman Empire, and later with Byzantium, on even more favorable terms. The shared religion created a bond of trust, a sense of common purpose, and when the Islamic conquests of the 7th century swept across the Middle East and North Africa, severing the old trade routes and transforming the geopolitical landscape, Axum's Christian identity became even more important, a marker of difference, a source of pride, and ultimately, a reason for both its survival and its isolation. To rule an empire requires more than monuments and faith. It requires a system of governance, a structure of authority that extends from the capital to the farthest provinces. In Axum, this structure was centered on the king. The king was not merely a political leader, he was a sacred figure, chosen by God, or in the earlier pagan period by the gods, to rule on behalf of the divine. His person was inviolable. To see the king was a privilege, and access to the royal presence was carefully controlled. When the king appeared in public, it was a ceremonial event, attended by elaborate ritual. The succession to the throne was, in theory, hereditary. The king's eldest son was the presumed heir, but this was not automatic. If the heir was judged unworthy, if he lacked the qualities necessary for kingship, the throne might pass to a younger brother or a cousin. This created opportunities for intrigue and conflict. Royal families in Axum, as in most monarchies, were riven by competition, with different branches maneuvering for power, forming alliances with nobles and generals, and sometimes resorting to violence. The historical record preserves hints of these struggles, references to kings who were overthrown or who died under mysterious circumstances, but the details are often lost. The king did not rule alone. He was surrounded by a court, a body of officials and advisors who managed the day-to-day administration of the empire. These officials were drawn from the nobility, the wealthy landowners and merchants who had the education and the resources to serve the state. The most important of these officials were the governors of the provinces. Axum's empire, at its height, extended over a vast area, from the highlands of northern Ethiopia down into modern Sudan, across the Red Sea into southern Arabia, and along the coast in both directions. Each of these regions had its own governor, appointed by the king, responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining order, and raising troops when needed. The governors were powerful men, often members of the royal family or closely allied noble clans. They ruled their provinces with considerable autonomy, but they were expected to send regular reports to the capital and to provide tribute, a portion of the taxes they collected, to the royal treasury. Taxation was the lifeblood of the state. The primary form of taxation was a levy on agricultural production. Farmers were required to give a portion of their harvest to the state, typically 1/10, though this could vary depending on the fertility of the land and the needs of the government. In addition to agricultural taxes, there were tolls on trade goods passing through Axumite territory, fees for the use of markets, and tribute from subject peoples. The collection of taxes was overseen by a class of officials, scribes and accountants who kept meticulous records. These records, though few have survived, were the administrative backbone of the empire, allowing the government to know how much revenue was coming in, where it was being spent, and whether governors were fulfilling their obligations. The military was another pillar of royal power. Axum maintained a standing army, though its size and composition changed over time. The core of the army was a body of professional soldiers, men who served the king in exchange for land grants or regular pay. These soldiers were organized into units, each commanded by an officer appointed by the king. The army also included levies, farmers and craftsmen called up in times of war to serve for a limited period. These levies were not professional soldiers, and their effectiveness varied, but they provided the numbers necessary for large campaigns. The army was equipped with spears, swords, and shields, and in later centuries with bows and arrows. Armor was less common, though elite soldiers might wear leather or metal helmets and breastplates. The army's mobility was a key to its success. Axumite forces could move quickly through the highlands, using their knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver enemies. They also deployed war elephants, a terrifying and effective weapon in open battle, though these were difficult to maintain and required considerable resources. Diplomacy was as important as military might. The kings of Axum maintained relations with the great powers of the ancient world, sending embassies to Rome, to Persia, and to the kingdoms of Arabia. These embassies were elaborate affairs, with ambassadors carrying gifts, letters, and proposals for alliances. The gifts were carefully chosen to display Axum's wealth and sophistication: ivory carvings, gold jewelry, fine textiles, and exotic animals. In return, Axumite kings received gifts from foreign rulers, reinforcing their status as equals on the world stage. These diplomatic relationships were not merely ceremonial. They had real consequences: opening markets, securing military aid, and protecting Axumite interests abroad. The arrival of a foreign embassy at Axum was a major event, orchestrated with careful attention to ceremony and protocol. Word would reach the city days in advance, carried by swift messengers, announcing that ambassadors from Rome or Constantinople or Persia were approaching. Preparations would begin immediately. The palace would be cleaned and adorned, hangings of fine cloth displayed, floors swept and sprinkled with aromatic herbs. The king would consult with his advisors about the appropriate response, about what gifts to offer, what concessions might be sought, what dangers the embassy might represent. Nothing was left to chance. Every gesture, every word, every gift carried meaning. On the day of the embassy's arrival, the entire court would assemble in formal dress. The king would sit on his throne, raised on a platform, so that he looked down upon all who approached. He would wear his finest regalia, a crown of gold, robes of silk and fine cotton, jewelry that caught and reflected the light. Around him would stand the high officials of the state, each in their proper place, according to rank, a visible demonstration of the ordered hierarchy of power. The palace guards, armed and impressive in their armor, would line the approach to the throne room, their presence a reminder of the king's military strength. The ambassadors, when they finally entered, would proceed slowly, with great dignity. They would be accompanied by their own guards and servants, carrying the gifts they had brought. The protocol of greeting was complex. The ambassadors would bow, but not prostrate themselves, for they represented sovereigns who were equals, not vassals. They would present their credentials, letters sealed with the marks of their rulers, which would be read aloud by a court scribe. Then would come the exchange of gifts. The foreign ambassadors would offer their presents, each one formally announced and displayed. Bolts of purple silk from Constantinople, amphora of rare wine from Italy, weapons of Damascus steel, hunting birds from the steppes of Asia. Each gift would be examined and admired, commented upon by the king and his advisors. In return, the king would present his own gifts, equally impressive: ivory carved into intricate figurines, or useful objects like combs and boxes, gold work, bracelets and rings crafted by the finest goldsmiths, exotic animal skins, leopard and lion, proof of Axum's connection to the wild interior of Africa, incense, frankincense and myrrh, the aromatic resins for which the region was famous, sometimes living animals, young elephants, or rare birds, gifts that were as much display of power as generosity, for only a wealthy and powerful state could afford to give away such valuable creatures. After the formal exchange, the ambassadors would be invited to a banquet, a feast designed to impress and to demonstrate Axumite hospitality. The meal would be elaborate, featuring dishes prepared by the palace cooks using ingredients from across the empire and beyond. There would be meat, roasted oxen and goats, game birds and fish. There would be stews flavored with exotic spices, pepper and ginger. There would be bread, not the everyday injera, but finer wheat bread, soft and white. There would be honey cakes and fruits preserved in syrup, and there would be drink, beer and wine, and tea, the honey wine that was a specialty of the highlands, sweet and potent. Musicians would play throughout the feast, drums and lyres and flutes, creating an atmosphere of celebration and abundance. During the meal and in the days that followed, the real work of diplomacy would take place in private meetings. Away from the formality of the throne room, the king and his advisors would negotiate with the ambassadors. These negotiations could be complex and delicate, An embassy from Rome might be seeking military assistance against Persia, offering in return favorable trade terms or support for Axum's own military ambitions. An embassy from Persia might be attempting to drive a wedge between Axum and Rome, offering an alternative alliance. An embassy from an Arabian kingdom might be seeking peace after a conflict or proposing a marriage alliance between royal houses. The Axumite negotiators had to balance multiple interests, seeking advantage while avoiding commitments that might prove dangerous or costly. The king himself might not be directly involved in all of these discussions. He had advisors, experienced diplomats who understood the international situation, who knew the languages and customs of foreign courts, who could read between the lines of formal proposals to understand the true interests at stake. These advisors would brief the king, present options, recommend courses of action, but the final decisions were his, and they could have far-reaching consequences. An ill-advised alliance might drag Axum into a costly war. A rejected embassy might create a powerful enemy. A successful negotiation might open new markets, secure military support, or enhance the empire's prestige. When the embassy finally departed, there would be another round of formal ceremonies. The ambassadors would take their leave of the king, receiving final gifts and messages to carry back to their rulers. They would be escorted to the edge of the city by a guard of honor, a visible sign of respect and a practical measure to ensure their safety. As they disappeared down the road toward the coast, the court would return to its regular rhythms, but the effects of the embassy would linger. Trade agreements would be implemented, letters would be exchanged, and the relationship between Axum and the foreign power would have been subtly adjusted, for better or worse. These diplomatic exchanges were not just about politics and economics, they were also cultural exchanges. Foreign ambassadors brought with them news of the wider world, stories of distant lands, descriptions of wonders and innovations. They brought books and maps, works of art and philosophy. They brought new ideas about religion, about science, about governance. Some of these ideas would be adopted, adapted to local circumstances, and integrated into Axumite culture. Others would be rejected, seen as incompatible with local values or beliefs. But the mere presence of these alternatives, the knowledge that other peoples organized their societies differently, practiced different religions, used different technologies, expanded the horizons of the Axumite elite, and contributed to the cosmopolitan character of the empire. The diplomatic correspondence itself was a form of art. Letters between kings were carefully composed, written in formal language on fine parchment or papyrus. They began with elaborate greetings and titles, acknowledging the recipient's status and power. They proceeded to the substance of the message, but always in indirect, courteous language. Direct demands or threats were rare. Instead, kings would make requests, offer suggestions, hint at possibilities. The letters would close with wishes for the recipient's health and prosperity, and with hopes for continued friendship. These letters were not private communications. They were official documents that might be read aloud in court, copied and distributed, preserved in archives. They were part of the historical record, shaping how future generations would understand the relationships between powers. Some of these letters have survived, copied by later chroniclers, or preserved in foreign archives. They provide fascinating glimpses into the diplomatic world of late antiquity. A letter from an Axumite king to the Byzantine emperor might discuss theological questions, for after the conversion to Christianity, religious issues became intertwined with politics. It might propose military cooperation against a common enemy. It might request the services of skilled craftsmen or architects. It might announce a victory or offer condolences on a defeat. Reading these letters today, we can sense the caution, the ambition, the pride of rulers who saw themselves as players on a world stage, who understood that words could be as powerful as weapons, and who used diplomacy as a tool to advance their interests and protect their people. Life at the royal court was a world unto itself. The palace complex in Axum was not just the king's residence. It was a small city, housing the royal family, the court officials, the palace guards, and an army of servants. The daily routine of the court was governed by ritual and protocol. The king rose early, attended morning prayers in the palace chapel, and then held court, receiving petitions, hearing disputes, and issuing decrees. The throne room was a place of formality, where every gesture, every word carried weight. Courtiers vied for the king's favor, offering counsel, presenting gifts, and seeking appointments to lucrative positions. The palace was also a center of culture and learning. Scribes worked in the palace scriptorium, copying texts and maintaining the royal archives. Poets and musicians performed for the king's entertainment, composing songs that celebrated his victories and his piety. Yet for all its grandeur, the court was also a place of vulnerability. Kings could be overthrown, poisoned, or assassinated. Heirs could be murdered to clear the path for rivals. And the king, for all his sacred status, was dependent on the loyalty of his officials and his generals. A king who lost the support of the nobility, who failed to win battles or maintain prosperity, could find his throne in jeopardy. This tension between the king's authority and the power of the nobles was a constant feature of Axumite politics, and it would become more pronounced as the empire faced external challenges and internal divisions. While the king and his court lived in splendor, the vast majority of Axum's subjects lived very different lives. The empire was an agricultural society, and the rhythm of daily life was dictated by the seasons, by the cycles of planting and harvest, by the rains that came and the droughts that sometimes did not. To understand Axum fully, you must leave the capital, leave the palaces and churches, and travel into the countryside, to the villages and farms where most people lived and worked. The highland villages of Axum were small, clustered settlements, rarely more than a few dozen families. The houses were simple, rectangular structures built of stone or of wattle and daub with roofs of thatch. Each house had a single main room, with a packed earth floor and a central hearth for cooking and warmth. Smoke from the fire rose through a hole in the roof, blackening the thatch and filling the interior with a haze that never quite cleared. The walls were bare, unplastered, though wealthier families might hang woven mats or textiles for decoration and insulation. Furniture was minimal, a few wooden stools, sleeping platforms raised above the floor, and large storage jars for grain and water. The family was the basic unit of life. Families were extended, often including 3 or even 4 generations living under one roof or in adjacent houses. The oldest male, the grandfather or great-uncle, was the patriarch, his word law within the household. Women managed the domestic sphere, preparing meals, tending to children, and overseeing the production of textiles, spinning thread from cotton or wool and weaving it into cloth. Children worked from an early age, helping with chores, herding animals, and learning the skills they would need as adults. There was no formal schooling for most children. Education was practical, passed down through observation and imitation. Boys learned to plow, to sew, and to repair tools. Girls learned to cook, to grind grain, and to carry water. The role of women in Axumite society was complex and varied depending on social class and location. In the villages, women's work was essential to survival. They were responsible for the household economy, managing food stores, preparing meals, and ensuring that the family had what it needed. This was not light work. A woman might wake before dawn to begin grinding grain, a process that could take 2 or 3 hours to produce enough flour for the day's bread. She would tend the fire, keeping it burning throughout the day for cooking and warmth. She would fetch water, sometimes making multiple trips to the well or stream, each time carrying a heavy jar on her head or shoulder. She would prepare meals, usually a stew simmered slowly over the fire, requiring constant attention to prevent burning. Women were also responsible for textile production, a crucial economic activity. The process began with the raw materials, cotton or wool, which had to be cleaned and prepared. Cotton arrived from the lowlands as fluffy bolls that needed to be separated from their seeds, a tedious task performed by hand. Wool came from sheep and goats, shorn in the spring, and had to be washed to remove lanolin and dirt. Once clean, the fibers were carded, a process of combing them with special paddles embedded with metal teeth to align them and remove any remaining impurities. The carded fiber was then spun into thread using a simple drop spindle, a weighted stick that would be set spinning while the fiber was drawn out and twisted. This was skilled work requiring practice to produce thread of consistent thickness and strength. Women would spin thread during any idle moment, while tending children, while sitting with neighbors, while walking from one place to another. The spun thread would be woven into cloth on upright looms. Weaving was often a communal activity, with several women working together, their shuttles flying back and forth in a steady rhythm. The finished cloth had multiple uses. Coarser fabrics were made into everyday clothing, work tunics and wraps. Finer fabrics might be decorated with embroidery, or saved for special occasions. Some cloth was produced for trade, adding to the family's income. The ability to produce quality textiles was a valued skill, and a woman known for her weaving could enhance her family's reputation and economic position. Women also played important roles in food preservation and processing. After the harvest, grain had to be stored carefully to last through the year. Women oversaw this process, ensuring that storage jars were clean and dry, that grain was properly dried before storage, and that pests were kept at bay. They prepared fermented foods, including the sour flatbread injera, which required maintaining a sourdough starter, a culture of wild yeasts and bacteria that gave the bread its characteristic flavor. They brewed beer, a nutritious beverage that was a staple of the diet. The brewing process took several days and required knowledge of fermentation, of when the grain had sprouted enough, when the mixture had fermented properly, when it was ready to drink. In elite households, women's roles were different, but no less important. Noble women did not perform manual labor, but they managed large households, supervising servants, organizing social events, and representing their families in the complex web of social relationships that bound the elite together. They arranged marriages for their children, negotiated alliances with other families, and managed the family's reputation. Some elite women were literate, educated by private tutors, and they might read religious texts or maintain correspondence with relatives in other cities. A few women wielded significant political power, serving as regents for young kings or as influential advisors behind the scenes. Children in Axumite society were valued but also viewed as economic assets. A large family meant more workers, more hands to help with the endless labor of agricultural life. Infant mortality was high, perhaps 1 in 3 children dying before the age of 5, so families were often large to ensure that some children survived to adulthood. Childbirth was dangerous for mothers as well, and it was attended by midwives, women experienced in assisting with deliveries. These midwives used traditional knowledge passed down through generations, understanding the stages of labor, knowing how to position the mother, how to handle complications. When birth went well, it was a time of joy and celebration. When it went badly, when a mother or child died, it was a tragedy that affected the entire community. Young children spent their early years close to their mothers, learning by watching and imitating. By the age of 5 or 6, they were expected to contribute to the household. Boys might begin by herding goats or sheep, learning to keep the animals together, to find good grazing, to protect them from predators. As they grew older, they would take on more demanding tasks, helping in the fields, learning to handle oxen, eventually being trusted with the plow. Girls learned domestic skills from their mothers and older women, starting with simple tasks like collecting firewood or minding younger siblings, gradually progressing to more complex work like grinding grain, spinning thread, and preparing meals. Childhood was short. By the early teenage years, young people were considered nearly adult and were expected to work at adult tasks. Marriage typically occurred in the mid to late teens for girls, slightly older for boys. Marriages were arranged by families, with parents negotiating terms, discussing bride wealth, the payment made by the groom's family to the bride's family, and considering the compatibility of the two families. Love might develop after marriage, but it was not the primary consideration. What mattered was creating alliances, ensuring economic security, and producing children to continue the family line. The agricultural year began with the arrival of the rains. In the highlands, the rainy season typically starts in June and lasts through September. These months are cool and wet, the skies heavy with clouds, the fields turning green with new growth. Before the rains, the fields must be prepared. Men plow the land using wooden plows drawn by oxen, turning the soil to break up the hard-packed earth and prepare it for planting. The plow is a simple tool, a wooden beam with an iron tip, but it requires skill to guide it in straight furrows. Once the fields are plowed, the seed is sown. Teff, the staple grain of the highlands, is scattered by hand, the seeds so small they are almost like dust. Other crops, barley, wheat, chickpeas, are planted in different fields, each chosen for its suitability to the soil and the altitude. The growing season is a time of anxious waiting. Farmers watch the skies, praying for steady rain, but not too much, for gentle showers that nourish the crops without washing away the soil. They tend to the fields, pulling weeds and protecting the young plants from birds and rodents. By late summer, the crops begin to ripen. The teff turns golden, the grain heads heavy. The harvest begins in September and continues into October. It is a time of intense labor. Men cut the grain with sickles, working from dawn until dusk. Women and children follow behind, gathering the stalks into sheaves and carrying them to the threshing floor, a flat, open area near the village. The threshing is done by driving oxen over the grain, their hooves separating the kernels from the stalks. Then the grain is winnowed, tossed into the air with wooden shovels so that the wind carries away the chaff while the heavier kernels fall back to the ground. The harvest is also a time of celebration. When the work is done, when the grain is safely stored, the village gathers for a feast. There is beer, brewed from barley or teff, and meat, a rare luxury, slaughtered for the occasion. There is music, simple drums and flutes, and dancing, the community coming together to give thanks and to enjoy a brief respite before the next cycle begins. But the harvest is also a time of reckoning. A portion of the grain must be set aside for the tax collectors, for the tribute owed to the king. Another portion must be saved for seed, for planting the next year's crop. What remains is the family's food for the coming months, the margin between survival and hunger. The rhythms of village life extended beyond the fields. Water, the most precious resource in any community, required constant attention. Women and girls made daily trips to the village well or to the nearest stream, carrying large clay jars balanced on their heads or shoulders. The journey might take an hour or more, following narrow paths worn smooth by generations of feet. At the water source, the women would gather, filling their jars but also exchanging news, sharing gossip, discussing marriages and births and deaths. These moments at the well were social occasions, brief respites from the endless work of the household. The return journey with the heavy jar full of water was slower, more careful. A stumble, a slip on a wet stone, and a jar might shatter, representing not just lost water but lost labor, for pottery was valuable and not easily replaced. The production of food consumed much of the day. Grain had to be ground into flour. A laborious process performed by women using flat grinding stones. They would kneel or sit, pushing a smaller stone back and forth across a larger one, crushing the grain between them. The work was rhythmic, almost meditative, but also physically demanding, wearing on the knees and arms. The flour, once ground, was mixed with water to form a dough which was then shaped into flat rounds and baked on a clay griddle over the fire. The resulting bread, injera, was spongy and slightly sour, perfect for scooping up stews and sauces. Every meal began with this bread, the fundamental sustenance of life in the highlands. The diet was simple but nourishing. Most meals consisted of a stew, made from lentils, chickpeas or beans, flavored with onions, garlic, and the distinctive berbere spice blend. Meat was rare, reserved for festivals or for when an animal had to be slaughtered due to age or injury. When meat was available, it was treated with reverence, every part of the animal used, nothing wasted. The fat was rendered for cooking, the bones boiled for broth, the hide tanned for leather. Vegetables, when in season, added variety. Cabbage, kale, and root vegetables were grown in small garden plots near the houses. Wild greens, gathered from the fields and hillsides, supplemented the cultivated crops. Life in the villages was not easy. Droughts were a constant threat. If the rains failed, the crops would wither and famine would follow. Disease, both human and animal, could devastate a village, and there was always the danger of raids, by bandits or by hostile groups from beyond the empire's borders. When illness struck, the village relied on traditional healers, men and women who knew the properties of local plants, who could set broken bones and treat fevers. Some ailments were attributed to spiritual causes, to curses, or to the displeasure of spirits, and these required different remedies, offerings and rituals performed by specialists who mediated between the human and spiritual worlds. Yet for all its hardships, village life had its rhythms and its satisfactions. People knew their place, their role in the community. There was a sense of belonging, of continuity, of connection to the land and to the ancestors who had worked it before them. The changing seasons brought different tasks, different challenges, but also different pleasures. In the cool months after the harvest, when the work was lighter, there was time for repair and maintenance, for weaving and pottery making, for storytelling around the evening fire. The elders would recount tales of the past, of legendary ancestors and ancient heroes, of the deeds of kings and the miracles of saints. These stories were the community's memory, its cultural inheritance, passed down through the generations, not in writing, but in the living voice, in the flickering firelight, in the hushed attention of children who would one day tell these same stories to their own grandchildren. In the towns and cities, life was different. Here, people made their living not from the land but from their skills, from the production and sale of goods and services. The artisan quarter of Axum was a place of constant activity. Potters shaped clay on their wheels, creating storage jars, cooking pots, and fine serving dishes. Metal workers hammered iron and bronze, forging tools, weapons, and ornaments. Weavers worked their looms, producing textiles of cotton and wool, some plain and serviceable, others dyed and embroidered for the wealthy. Leather workers tanned hides, cutting and stitching them into sandals, belts, and bags. Each craft had its own techniques, its own secrets, passed down from master to apprentice. The potter's workshop was a place of earth and transformation. Clay, dug from riverbanks and carefully prepared, was needed to remove air bubbles and to achieve the right consistency. The potter sat at a simple wheel, often just a flat stone disc mounted on a pivot which an apprentice would spin by hand. As the wheel turned, the potter's hands moved with practiced grace, shaping the spinning clay into vessels of remarkable symmetry and beauty. The craft required years to master, a delicate balance of pressure and timing, of knowing when to push and when to pull, when to add water and when to let the clay firm. The shaped vessels were left to dry in the shade, then decorated with incised patterns or painted designs before being fired in a kiln. The firing process was critical, the temperature and duration carefully controlled to ensure the clay hardened properly without cracking. A successful firing might produce dozens of usable vessels, a failed one could destroy days of work. The metal workers occupied a different world, one of fire and force. The blacksmith's forge was built of stone and clay, with bellows made from animal hide that pumped air into the coals, raising the temperature to the point where iron would glow red and become malleable. The blacksmith and his apprentices worked with hammers and tongs, heating the metal, shaping it on the anvil, then plunging it into water to cool and harden it. The work was hot, dirty, and dangerous. Sparks flew with each hammer blow, and the constant heat of the forge made the workshop stifling even in the cool highland air. Yet it was also work of great prestige. Iron tools were essential to agriculture, to construction, to warfare. A skilled blacksmith could produce plowshares that would last for years, knives that held a keen edge, and spearheads that could pierce armor. Some blacksmiths also worked in bronze, casting bells for churches, ornamental fittings for furniture, and ceremonial objects for the wealthy. The jewelry makers worked with the most precious materials. Gold and silver, imported through the trade networks or collected as tribute, were melted in small crucibles and cast into ingots. These ingots were then hammered into thin sheets or drawn into wire. The jewelry maker used simple tools, small hammers, files, and punches, to create intricate designs. Rings, bracelets, and necklaces were fashioned, often incorporating imported beads of carnelian, glass, or semi-precious stones. The finest pieces were reserved for the nobility and the royal court, visible symbols of wealth and status. A merchant's wife might wear a single gold ring, a mark of her husband's success. A noble woman might be adorned with multiple necklaces, heavy bracelets on both arms, and elaborate earrings that caught the light as she moved. The textile workers operated in quieter spaces, though their work was no less skilled. Weaving in Axum used upright looms, tall frames where vertical warp threads were stretched and horizontal weft threads were passed through them using a shuttle. The work was precise and rhythmic, the shuttle flying back and forth, the weaver using a beater to press each new row of weft tightly against the previous one. Cotton grown in the lowlands and imported to the highlands was the primary fiber, though wool from sheep and goats was also used. The raw fiber had to be cleaned, carded to align the fibers, and spun into thread before it could be woven. Spinning was often women's work, done during idle moments, the spindle twirling as thread grew from a handful of fluff, dyeing added color and value. Natural dyes extracted from plants, minerals, and insects produced a limited but beautiful palette. Red came from madder root, yellow from turmeric, blue from indigo, and a precious purple from a rare shellfish. The dyed threads were woven into patterns, stripes, and checks, or left plain for later embroidery. Fine textiles were a major trade good, exported to other regions where the quality of Axumite weaving was renowned. The leather workers dealt with transformation of another kind, turning raw animal hides into durable, useful material. The tanning process was long and unpleasant. Fresh hides, stiff and prone to rot, had to be treated to preserve them. They were soaked in water, scraped clean of hair and fat, then immersed in tanning solutions made from tree bark rich in tannins. The hides remained in these baths for weeks or even months, slowly absorbing the chemicals that would prevent decay and make the leather supple. Once tanned, the leather was dried, stretched, and worked to soften it. Skilled leather workers could produce a range of products, from heavy ox hide suitable for shield covers and harness straps to soft, thin leather for garments and bookbindings. The smell of tanneries was notorious, one of the less pleasant aspects of urban life, and these workshops were typically located on the outskirts of cities, downwind from the residential areas. Each craft had its own techniques, its own secrets, passed down from master to apprentice. The apprenticeship system was the foundation of skill transmission. A boy, typically between 8 and 12 years old, would be sent to live with a master craftsman, often a relative or family friend. The apprentice's labor was payment for his training. He would begin with the simplest, most menial tasks, fetching water, cleaning the workshop, preparing materials. As he grew older and more skilled, he would be entrusted with more complex work, learning by observation and imitation. After years of service, perhaps 7 or even 10, the apprentice would become a journeyman, a skilled worker who could hire himself out for wages. Eventually, if he was talented and fortunate, he might establish his own workshop, taking on apprentices of his own, continuing the cycle. The market was the economic heart of the city. It met daily, a sprawling, chaotic space where farmers from the surrounding countryside brought their produce, where artisans displayed their wares, and where merchants offered goods from distant lands. The air was filled with the sounds of haggling, the sharp, rhythmic exchange of prices and counteroffers. The market was a place of social interaction, where news was exchanged, where marriages were arranged, where disputes were settled. It was also a place of hierarchy. The best stalls in the center of the market were reserved for the wealthiest merchants, those who dealt in imported luxuries. The outer edges were occupied by poorer sellers, farmers with a few vegetables, women selling homemade beer or bread. The merchant class in Axum occupied a unique position. They were not nobles, not part of the old landowning elite, but their wealth gave them influence. Successful merchants could afford fine homes, could educate their children, and could make advantageous marriages into noble families. They also had connections, networks of contacts in other cities, in other lands, that gave them access to information and opportunity. Some merchants became very rich, rich enough to rival the nobility, and they used their wealth to gain political power, to become patrons of churches, to fund public works. But they were also vulnerable. A failed venture, a shipwreck, a war that disrupted trade routes could wipe out a merchant's fortune in an instant. Religious life was woven into the fabric of daily existence. After the conversion to Christianity, churches became central to community life. Even small villages had their own church, a simple stone building with a thatched roof and a small bell tower. The church was not just a place of worship, it was a school where priests taught boys to read and write gaze, to memorize the Psalms and to serve at the altar. It was a social center, where the community gathered for festivals and celebrations, and it was a refuge, a place of sanctuary where those fleeing violence or injustice could seek protection. The rhythm of the Christian year, with its fasts and feasts, its seasons of penance and joy, structured time in the villages and cities. The great festivals, Easter, Christmas, Epiphany, were occasions for communal celebration, for processions and feasting, for the temporary suspension of work and the affirmation of shared identity. The celebration of these festivals transformed the ordinary into the sacred. Easter, the most important feast in the Christian calendar, was preceded by a long fast. For 55 days, the faithful abstained from meat, dairy, and eggs, living on a simple diet of grains, legumes, and vegetables. The fast was not merely dietary, it was spiritual, a time of prayer, confession, and preparation. Churches held services every evening. The liturgy chanted in the ancient ge'ez, the smell of incense filling the darkened space. As Easter approached, the anticipation grew. On the night before Easter Sunday, the entire community would gather at the church for an all-night vigil. Candles were lit, one flame passing to another until the entire church glowed with hundreds of small lights. At dawn, as the sun rose over the highlands, the bells would ring, announcing the resurrection. The fast was broken with a great feast. tables laden with meat, bread and beer, the community coming together in celebration. Christmas, too, was a time of joy. In the Highlands, December is part of the dry season, the weather cool and clear. Churches would be decorated with fresh greenery, and families would prepare special foods, rich stews and honeyed bread. The liturgy on Christmas Eve lasted deep into the night, with hymns and readings telling the story of the Nativity. Children dressed in their finest clothes would receive small gifts, and the air was filled with a sense of wonder and anticipation. Epiphany, celebrated in January, commemorated the baptism of Christ. In Axum and other cities, this was marked by elaborate processions to rivers or springs, where priests would bless the water and renew baptismal vows. The celebrations often included music and dancing, a blending of the sacred and the joyful that was characteristic of Ethiopian Christianity. The monastic movement also took root in Axum, shaping the spiritual landscape of the empire. Men, and sometimes women, seeking a life of prayer and asceticism, withdrew from the world to live in small communities in remote locations, on mountaintops or in the wilderness. These monasteries became centers of learning and spirituality. Monks copied manuscripts, composed hymns, and developed theological doctrines. They also served as a moral authority, offering counsel to the laity and rebuking kings and nobles when they strayed from righteousness. The monasteries were supported by donations, by grants of land from the king or from wealthy patrons, and by the labor of their own members, who farmed, brewed beer, and produced textiles. The life of a monk was one of discipline and renunciation. The day began before dawn, with the first prayers recited while the stars still filled the sky. The liturgy of the hours structured the day, with prayers at regular intervals from morning until night. Between the services, monks engaged in manual labor, tending gardens, maintaining buildings, or working in the scriptorium, the room where manuscripts were copied. The copying of texts was considered a sacred act, a way of preserving God's word and making it available to future generations. The work required patience and precision. A single manuscript might take months to complete, each letter carefully formed, each page a work of devotion. Monastic life also involved ascetic practices, deliberate acts of self-denial meant to purify the soul and draw closer to God. Monks fasted regularly, sometimes consuming only bread and water. They practiced vigils, going without sleep to spend the night in prayer. Some monks lived as hermits, in caves or simple cells, seeing no one for weeks or months at a time, their only companions the silence and their own thoughts. These extreme forms of asceticism were admired by the faithful, who saw in them a higher form of holiness. Pilgrims would seek out famous hermits, climbing remote mountains to receive a blessing or a word of wisdom. The hermits, though withdrawn from the world, were seen as intercessors, their prayers thought to be especially powerful because of their sacrifice. Pilgrimage itself became an important part of religious life in Christian Axum. The Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion was the most important pilgrimage destination, believed to house the Ark of the Covenant. Pilgrims came from across the empire and beyond, traveling for weeks to reach the holy city. The journey was itself an act of devotion, a sacrifice of time and comfort. Pilgrims walked, carrying few possessions, often sleeping rough along the way. When they finally reached Axum, they would approach the church with reverence, some prostrating themselves on the ground, others weeping with emotion. Inside the church, they would pray, light candles, and make offerings, seeking healing, forgiveness, or simply the blessing of being in such a sacred place. The church also played a role in the life cycle of individuals. Birth, marriage, and death were marked by religious rituals that connected the individual to the community and to the divine. When a child was born, it would be brought to the church for baptism, typically 40 days after birth. The priest would bless the infant, anointing it with holy oil and immersing it briefly in water, symbolizing the child's entry into the Christian community. Marriage, too, was a church ceremony, though it was also a social and economic arrangement negotiated between families. The bride and groom would stand before the priest, who would bless their union and pray for their fertility and prosperity. Death was accompanied by elaborate rituals. The body would be washed and wrapped in a simple shroud, then carried to the church for a funeral service. The priest would chant prayers, commending the soul to God, and the community would gather to mourn and to remember. Burial took place in consecrated ground, often near the church, and families would return regularly to pray at the graves of their ancestors. Yet even in this Christian empire, older beliefs persisted. In the countryside, people continued to honor the spirits of the land, to make offerings at sacred trees and springs, to consult diviners and healers who worked with the old magic. These practices were officially discouraged by the church, sometimes condemned as pagan, but they never entirely disappeared. Instead, they blended with Christianity, creating a syncretic faith that was uniquely Ethiopian, a faith that honored both Christ and the ancestors, that saw holiness in both the church and the natural world. A farmer might pray to the Christian God for rain, but also make an offering at a sacred grove, hedging his spiritual bets. A healer might invoke the names of angels and saints, but also use charms and amulets inherited from pre-Christian traditions. This blending was not seen as contradictory by most people. It was simply the way faith worked, a recognition that the sacred could manifest in many forms, that the divine was present in the church, but also in the mountains, the rivers, and the earth itself. The church also maintained a complex relationship with the state. While Christianity gave the kings of Axum a source of legitimacy and a connection to the wider Christian world, it also imposed constraints. The church claimed moral authority, the right to speak on matters of justice and righteousness. Bishops and abbots could, and sometimes did, challenge royal policies, condemning unjust taxes, cruel punishments, or aggressive wars. Kings had to balance their political needs with their religious obligations, and this tension was a constant feature of Axumite governance. Some kings were remembered as saints, men who combined piety with effective rule. Others were criticized by later chroniclers for their impiety or their cruelty, their reigns seen as divine punishment for straying from the faith. Beyond the formal structures of religion and governance, the cultural life of Axum was rich and varied. Music played an important role in both sacred and secular contexts. The Christian liturgy was chanted, using traditional melodies that had been passed down through generations. These chants, sung in jebes, created an atmosphere of solemnity and transcendence in the churches. The melodies were modal, based on scales and patterns different from those of European music, giving Ethiopian Christian music its distinctive character. Priests and deacons trained for years to master these chants, learning not just the melodies but also the proper pronunciation of the ancient liturgical language and the meaning of the texts they were singing. Outside the church, music accompanied work and celebration. Farmers sang as they plowed, rhythmic chants that helped coordinate the movement of multiple workers or that simply made the labor less tedious. Women sang as they ground grain, their songs often telling stories or commenting on village life. At celebrations, professional musicians would perform. These musicians used a variety of instruments. Drums of various sizes provided rhythm, from small hand drums to large drums that could be heard across great distances. The kra, a lyre with 5 or 6 strings, was a popular instrument, its sound both melodic and rhythmic. The masinko, a single-stringed bowed instrument, produced a haunting singing tone. Flutes, made from bamboo or bone, added high, clear melodies, and the human voice, always central, carried the songs that told stories, celebrated heroes, mourned the dead, and expressed the full range of human emotion. Dance was equally important. At festivals and celebrations, people would dance in circles or lines, their movements synchronized, their feet stamping out complex rhythms on the ground. The dances were often vigorous, athletic displays of endurance and skill. Some dances had religious significance, performed at church festivals as acts of devotion. Others were purely social, opportunities for young people to see and be seen, for communities to come together in shared joy. Still others were martial, war dances that trained young men in the coordinated movements required for battle and that displayed the community's military readiness. The great festivals of the year were occasions for the full expression of Axumite cultural life. Timkat, the celebration of Epiphany, was one of the most important. This festival, held in January, commemorated the baptism of Christ in the Jordan River. On the eve of Timkat, each church would bring out its tablet, a sacred object representing the Ark of the Covenant, wrapped in rich cloth and carried in procession to a nearby body of water. The processions were spectacular. Priests in their finest vestments, carrying ornate crosses and censers swinging incense, would lead the way. Deacons would chant, their voices rising and falling in ancient melodies. The congregation would follow, dressed in white garments, carrying candles that created rivers of light in the darkness. At the water's edge, the tablets would be placed in specially prepared shelters, and the community would keep vigil through the night, singing, praying, and recounting the sacred stories. At dawn, the bishop would bless the water, plunging a cross into it 3 times to symbolize the Trinity. Then the people would be sprinkled with the blessed water, renewing their baptismal vows. Some would wade into the water itself, fully immersing themselves. The atmosphere was one of joy and renewal, a sense of spiritual cleansing and recommitment. After the blessing, the processions would return to the churches, the tablets carried back with the same ceremony and reverence. The rest of the day would be given over to feasting and celebration, families gathering to share meals, neighbors exchanging visits and gifts. Mescal, the festival of the finding of the true cross, was another major celebration. This festival, held in September, marked the end of the rainy season and the beginning of the harvest. At the center of the celebration was a large bonfire, built in the town square or in an open space near the church. The bonfire was constructed over days, with community members bringing branches and wood, building the pile higher and higher. On the eve of the festival, after prayers and blessings, the bonfire would be lit. As the flames roared into the sky, people would dance around it, singing and celebrating. The direction in which the bonfire collapsed was believed to predict the future, to indicate which parts of the country would prosper in the coming year. The ashes from the bonfire were considered blessed, and people would mark their foreheads with them as a sign of faith. Secular festivals also punctuated the year. Market days, occurring weekly in most towns, were not just economic events but social occasions. People would come from surrounding villages, dressed in their best clothes, to buy and sell, to meet friends and relatives, to exchange news and gossip. Traveling entertainers might perform, acrobats and storytellers who moved from town to town, bringing amusement and news of the wider world. Wrestling matches and horse races might be organized, with young men competing for prizes and prestige. These market days were vital to the social fabric, maintaining connections between dispersed communities, facilitating marriages and business partnerships, and reinforcing the sense of shared identity. Weddings were among the most elaborate private celebrations. When a marriage was arranged, the families would negotiate not just the bride wealth, but also the details of the celebration. A wealthy family might host a feast lasting several days, with dozens or even hundreds of guests. The celebration would begin with the formal betrothal, where representatives of the two families would meet to finalize the agreement. On the wedding day, the bride would be prepared by the women of her family, dressed in her finest clothes, adorned with jewelry, her hands and feet decorated with henna patterns. The groom, similarly adorned, would process to the bride's home with his friends and relatives, singing and playing music. The couple would be blessed by a priest, either at the church or at one of the homes. Then would come the feast, with meat and beer in abundance, with music and dancing lasting into the night. Funerals too were communal events. When someone died, the body would be washed and wrapped, then laid out in the home for viewing. Neighbors and relatives would come to pay their respects, to mourn with the family, and to offer support. The mourning could be loud and expressive, with wailing and crying that gave voice to grief. Professional mourners might be hired, women who knew the traditional laments and who could lead the community in expressing sorrow. The funeral procession to the church and then to the burial ground would be accompanied by chanting and prayer. After the burial, the family would host a meal for those who had attended, an act of hospitality even in the midst of grief. Mourning would continue for days or weeks, with the family observing restrictions, wearing simple clothing, abstaining from celebrations, and gradually returning to normal life. These rituals, from the grand state ceremonies to the intimate family celebrations, wove together the fabric of Axumite society. They marked the passage of time, the turning of seasons, the milestones of individual lives. They reinforced social bonds, reminded people of shared beliefs and values, and created a sense of continuity with the past. In a world where life was often hard, where survival was uncertain, where disease and drought and violence were constant threats, these moments of celebration and mourning, of music and dance and shared meals, were what made life meaningful, what transformed mere existence into something rich and human. Axum's rise to power was not solely a matter of trade and culture. It was also a military achievement. The empire expanded through conquest, extending its authority over neighboring peoples and establishing its dominance in the region. The most famous of these conquests was the invasion of southern Arabia across the Red Sea, a campaign that demonstrated both the ambition and the capacity of the Axumite state. In the early 6th century, the kingdom of Himyar, in what is now Yemen, was in turmoil. Himyar had been a wealthy kingdom, controlling the trade routes of the southern Red Sea and the Arabian Peninsula. It was also a religiously diverse place, home to Christians, Jews, and polytheists. In the early 520s, a Jewish king named Du-Nuwas came to power in Himyar. According to later Christian accounts, Du-Nuwas launched a persecution of the Christian community, massacring hundreds of believers and destroying churches. News of this persecution reached Axum, and the Axumite king Caleb decided to intervene. Caleb's motives were mixed. There was a genuine religious dimension. As a Christian king, he saw himself as the protector of Christians everywhere, and the persecution in Himyar was a call to action. But there were also political and economic motives. Himyar controlled valuable trade routes, and bringing it under Axumite influence would greatly increase the empire's wealth and power. In 525, Caleb assembled a fleet and an army. The logistics of this campaign were formidable. Ships had to be built or requisitioned, supplies gathered, soldiers trained and equipped. The fleet, once assembled, crossed the Red Sea, a journey of several days, and landed on the Arabian coast. The preparation for such a campaign reveals much about Axumite military capacity. The fleet was assembled at Obelisks and other coastal ports. Shipwrights worked for months, constructing the vessels needed to transport thousands of troops across open water. The ships were substantial, built to carry not just men but also horses, war elephants, and supplies for an extended campaign. The hull construction used techniques borrowed from various maritime traditions, with planks fitted edge to edge and sealed with pitch to make them watertight. Each ship required enormous quantities of timber, much of it brought down from the highlands where suitable trees grew. The sails were woven from cotton or flax, treated to withstand the salt spray and the constant sun. Ropes, essential for rigging and for controlling the sails, were made from twisted fibers, laboriously produced by rope makers whose craft was critical to maritime success. The soldiers who would make the crossing were a mix of professional warriors and levied farmers. The professionals were equipped with the best weapons and armor the empire could provide. They wore leather helmets reinforced with metal bands, and some had scale armor, small metal plates sewn onto leather backing that provided protection while allowing movement. They carried spears with iron heads, swords for close combat, and round shields made of wood and covered with hide. The levied troops were less well equipped, often armed with little more than a spear and a simple wooden shield, but they provided the numbers necessary for a major expedition. The war elephants, perhaps the most fearsome element of the force, required special handling. These massive animals had to be coaxed aboard specially built transport vessels, a process that was dangerous and time-consuming. The crossing of the Red Sea was itself a test of skill and courage. The Red Sea is not a gentle body of water. It is subject to sudden storms, to strong currents, and to treacherous reefs that can tear the bottom out of a ship. The fleet would have waited for favorable winds, for a season when the weather was most predictable. Even so, the crossing was dangerous. Soldiers who had never been to sea would have experienced the terror and disorientation of being on open water, of watching the land disappear behind them and seeing nothing but waves in every direction. Seasickness would have afflicted many, and the cramped conditions aboard the ships, with hundreds of men packed together, would have been miserable. Fresh water was rationed carefully, and food consisted of dried bread, salted fish, and whatever could be prepared in the small cooking areas on deck. When the fleet finally sighted the Arabian coast, the relief must have been immense. The ships navigated carefully into a suitable landing site, a beach or harbor where they could disembark without being trapped by hostile forces. The landing itself was a complex operation. Ships were beached or anchored close to shore, and men waded through the surf, carrying their weapons and equipment above their heads to keep them dry. The horses and elephants were more difficult, requiring ramps or being forced to swim the final distance. Once ashore, the army had to quickly establish a defensive perimeter, for they were now in enemy territory, vulnerable to attack. The campaign was swift and decisive. Du-Nuwa's forces were defeated in battle, and the king himself, according to legend, rode his horse into the sea and drowned rather than face capture. The battle itself would have been brutal and chaotic. Axumite infantry would have formed shield walls, overlapping their shields to create a barrier against enemy spears and arrows. Behind this wall, soldiers would thrust with their own spears, trying to break the enemy formation. When the shield walls clashed, the fighting became desperate, a shoving match of men straining against each other, trying to force a breakthrough. the war elephants played a crucial role. These enormous animals, driven forward by their plateaus, crashed into enemy lines, trampling soldiers and creating panic. The sight and sound of these beasts trumpeting and charging was often enough to break the morale of less experienced troops. Caleb installed a Christian viceroy to rule Himyar on behalf of Axum, and for the next several decades, southern Arabia was effectively an Axumite province. This conquest brought immense prestige to Axum. It demonstrated that the empire could project power across the sea, that it was not merely a highland kingdom but a force to be reckoned with in the wider world. It also brought wealth, as the trade routes of Arabia now flowed through Axumite hands. Garrisons were established in key cities, and Axumite officials took over the collection of taxes and the administration of justice. The local population, accustomed to their own rulers, chafed under foreign occupation, but for a time, Axumite military power was sufficient to maintain control. But the occupation of Himyar was not easy to maintain. The distances were great, the costs high, and the local population was often hostile. Resupplying the garrisons required regular sea voyages, and each voyage carried risks. Ships could be lost to storms, to pirates, or to mechanical failure. The soldiers stationed in Arabia suffered from disease, from the harsh climate, and from constant low-level conflict with local insurgents. After Caleb's death, his successors struggled to hold on to the Arabian territories. The commitment of resources required to maintain the occupation strained the empire's finances and diverted attention from other threats. Eventually, in the mid-6th century, Axumite control collapsed. Local rulers reasserted their independence, and Arabia passed into the hands of other powers, first the Persians and then, in the 7th century, the Arabs who would carry Islam across the region. But for a brief moment, Axum had been a power on both sides of the Red Sea, a true empire that spanned continents. Military power in Axum was not just about foreign conquest, it was also about internal control, about the ability to suppress rebellions, to enforce the king's authority in distant provinces, and to protect the borders from raids. The army, as mentioned, was a mix of professional soldiers and levies. The professional soldiers were the elite, men who had trained for years, who knew the tactics and the discipline required for large-scale warfare. They fought in formation, using shields and spears to create a wall of defense, and then closing in with swords and hand-to-hand combat. The levies were less skilled, but they provided numbers and could be effective in sieges or in defensive battles where sheer manpower was more important than training. Elephants were a unique feature of Axumite military power. These animals, captured and trained for war, were used both as shock troops and as symbols of royal might. A war elephant, with its massive size and strength, could break through enemy lines, trample infantry, and create panic. But elephants were also difficult to control, prone to panic themselves if wounded or frightened, and they required enormous amounts of food and care. Their use was therefore limited, reserved for major campaigns or for ceremonial purposes. Naval power was equally important. Axum's control of the Red Sea required a fleet capable of protecting trade routes, of transporting troops, and of projecting power across the water. The Axumite fleet was built at Obelisks and other coastal ports. The ships were likely similar to those used by other Red Sea powers, with wooden hulls, square or triangular sails, and rows of oars for maneuvering in calm waters or in battle. Naval warfare in the Red Sea was often about boarding and hand-to-hand combat as ships closed with each other and marines fought for control of the decks. The fleet also served as a deterrent, a visible sign of Axumite power that discouraged piracy and protected the merchant vessels that were the lifeblood of the empire's economy. Yet military power alone does not explain Axum's success. Equally important was its ability to communicate, to record, to administer. And at the heart of this capacity was a written language, a script that allowed the empire to transcend the limitations of oral tradition and to create a lasting record of its deeds. The Gud script is one of the oldest continuously used writing systems in the world. It is an abuguda, a type of script where each symbol represents a consonant with an inherent vowel sound which can be modified by diacritical marks to represent different vowels. The script is beautiful, with flowing, geometric characters that are distinctly different from the angular letters of the Latin or Greek alphabets. Guts was not created in Axum. It evolved from earlier South Arabian scripts brought across the Red Sea by the migrations of centuries past. But it was in Axum that Guts flourished. that it became the language of power, of religion, of culture. The written word was a tool of governance. Royal decrees were inscribed on stone stelae, ensuring that the king's commands were public and permanent. These inscriptions are one of the most important sources of information about Axum, providing details about military campaigns, religious policies, and the king's relationship with his subjects. The language of these inscriptions is often formulaic, beginning with invocations to the gods or to God, followed by a narrative of the king's deeds, and ending with curses against anyone who would deface or destroy the monument. But even in their formality, these inscriptions reveal much about the values and concerns of the Axumite elite. Literacy in Axum was not widespread. It was the preserve of the elite, of the scribes and priests, who had the education and the leisure to master the complex script. These scribes were essential to the functioning of the state. They kept the tax records, drafted the royal correspondence, and copied the religious texts that were the foundation of Christian Axum. The process of becoming a scribe began in childhood. Boys, typically from wealthy or noble families, were sent to the church to study under a priest. They learned to read and write ges, to memorize the Psalms and the Gospels, and to understand the liturgy. The training was rigorous, taking years, but it opened doors to positions of influence and respect. The written word was also a means of preserving culture. The Christian scriptures, translated into ges, became the shared text of the empire, a common reference point that bound together people from different regions and different backgrounds. But ges was not used only for religious texts. There were also legal codes, medical treatises, and works of history and hagiography. The ges literary tradition, which began in Axum, would continue for centuries, long after the empire itself had faded, and it remains a living tradition in Ethiopia today. The use of writing also had political implications. A king who could issue written decrees, who could send letters to foreign rulers, who could record his victories for posterity, was a king who had power. Writing was a technology of authority, a way of asserting control over space and time. And the scribes who wielded this technology were, in their own way, as important as the generals and the governors, for they were the ones who kept the empire's memory alive. But even as Axum reached the height of its power and sophistication, the world around it was changing. The 7th century brought upheavals that would reshape the entire region. The most significant of these was the rise of Islam, a new religion and a new political force that emerged from the Arabian Peninsula and spread with astonishing speed across the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. The Islamic conquests did not reach Axum itself. The highlands were too remote, too difficult to invade, but the conquests transformed the world in which Axum operated. The Arab conquests of the 7th century severed many of the old trade routes. Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia, once part of the Christian Roman and Byzantine world, now fell under Islamic rule. The Red Sea, which had been a highway of commerce linking Axum to Rome and Byzantium, became contested space. Arab fleets began to dominate the sea, and the old networks of trade, built on centuries of contact and cooperation, were disrupted. Adulis, the great port that had been Axum's gateway to the world, declined. Ships came less frequently. The goods that had flowed in such abundance, the wine, the oil, the glass, the gold, began to dry up. The revenues that the Axumite state depended on, the taxes and tolls collected at the port, diminished. Axum did not fall immediately. The empire had deep reserves of strength, and it adapted to the new reality. But the loss of the trade routes was a blow from which it would never fully recover. The wealth that had funded the great monuments, the churches, the court, began to ebb away. And with the loss of wealth came a loss of power. Governors in distant provinces, no longer receiving support from the capital, began to assert their independence. The military, no longer able to pay its soldiers or to maintain its equipment, weakened. The state, which had been so strong, so confident, began to fragment. There were other factors as well. The climate itself seems to have changed. Paleoclimatic evidence suggests that the 7th and 8th centuries were a period of increasing aridity in the Horn of Africa. The rains became less reliable, the growing season shorter. Harvests failed more often, and the agricultural surplus that had supported the cities and the army began to shrink. Famine became more common, and with famine came social unrest. People migrated, seeking better land, fleeing the failing harvests. The population of the highlands, which had grown steadily for centuries, may have begun to decline. The evidence for this climate shift comes from multiple sources. Studies of lake sediments show changes in pollen composition, indicating a shift from forest and grassland to more arid vegetation. Tree ring data, where available, shows periods of reduced growth consistent with drought. Historical sources, though sparse for this period, contain references to famines and crop failures. The impact of these environmental changes would have been felt first and most severely in the marginal lands, the areas where agriculture was already precarious. As these lands became unproductive, their inhabitants would have moved, putting pressure on the more fertile core areas. This migration would have disrupted established social structures, created conflicts over resources, and weakened the bonds that held communities together. The agricultural crisis had cascading effects throughout society. With less food being produced, the surplus available to support non-agricultural populations shrank. The cities which depended on food imports from the countryside began to experience shortages, prices rose, and those who could not afford the inflated costs went hungry. The urban poor, artisans and laborers who had no land of their own, were hit hardest. Some left the cities, returning to the countryside in hopes of finding work or land. Others stayed, surviving on charity from churches or on whatever work they could find. The wealthy, those with stores of grain and other resources, weathered the crisis better, but even they felt the pinch as their incomes from trade and rents declined. The royal court, which had been sustained by taxes and trade revenues, found its income dwindling. The elaborate ceremonies, the maintenance of the palaces, the support of the army, all required resources that were increasingly scarce. Kings were forced to make difficult choices. They could reduce expenditures, cutting back on court luxuries and military campaigns, but this diminished their prestige and their ability to project power. Or they could increase taxes, demanding more from a population already struggling, but this risked provoking rebellion. Some kings attempted both strategies, with predictable results. Overtaxed provinces rebelled or simply stopped paying tribute. Neighboring peoples, sensing weakness, raided across the borders, seizing livestock and captives. Internal conflicts also played a role. The royal family, always prone to intrigue and competition, became increasingly divided. There are hints in the historical record of civil wars, of rival claimants to the throne, of provinces breaking away and establishing their own independent kingdoms. The succession disputes were particularly damaging. When a king died, rather than a clear transfer of power to an eldest son or designated heir, multiple princes might claim the throne, each backed by different factions of the nobility. These disputes could turn violent, with armies raised and battles fought, draining resources and destabilizing the state. Even when a clear victor emerged, the legacy of the conflict lingered, with resentments and divisions that weakened the new king's authority. The loss of central authority manifested in various ways. In distant provinces, governors who had been appointed by the king began to act as independent rulers, passing their positions to their sons, establishing local dynasties. The armies that had once been commanded by the king fragmented into smaller forces loyal to regional lords. The road system, which had been maintained by the state to facilitate trade and the movement of troops, fell into disrepair. Without regular maintenance, bridges collapsed, roads washed out, and travel became more difficult and dangerous. This further hindered trade and communication, accelerating the empire's decline. The city of Axum itself was abandoned, or perhaps more accurately, it shrank to a fraction of its former size. The great palaces fell into ruin. The process was gradual. First, the royal court moved to other locations, following kings who chose to establish their capitals elsewhere, either for strategic reasons or simply because the old city had become too associated with past glories and present decline. Without the court, the nobles and wealthy merchants also left, seeking opportunities elsewhere. The artisans and traders who had served the elite followed. Buildings that had been maintained for centuries were suddenly empty, their roofs collapsing, their walls cracking as vegetation took root in the joints between stones. The stelae, which had stood for centuries as symbols of royal power, began to topple. Some may have been deliberately destroyed by rival kings or by invaders seeking to erase the memory of Axum's greatness. Others simply fell due to neglect and the gradual erosion of their foundations. The great obelisks, so carefully carved and erected, crashed to the ground, breaking into massive fragments. The sound of their falling must have been apocalyptic. a thunderous crack followed by the ground-shaking impact. To those who witnessed it, these collapses would have seemed like omens, visible proof that the old order was ending, that the power and glory of Axum were passing away. The churches, however, remained. The Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, in particular, continued to be maintained and venerated. Even as the city around it declined, the church stood as a focal point of continuity. Priests continued to perform the liturgy, pilgrims continued to come seeking blessings, and the sacred traditions were preserved. This religious continuity was crucial. While the political entity of Axum was dying, the cultural and spiritual legacy lived on. The church became the keeper of memory, the institution that bridged the gap between the glorious past and an uncertain future. The population that remained in Axum and the surrounding areas adapted to the new reality. They reverted to more localized economies, producing for immediate needs rather than for distant markets. The grand international trade that had made Axum rich became a memory, and life became more isolated, more focused on survival. Yet even in this reduced state, the memory of what Axum had been persisted. Stories were told, passed down through generations, of the great kings, of the wealth that had flowed through the city, of the monuments that had once touched the sky. These stories, embellished and transformed over time, kept the name of Axum alive even as the city itself faded. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Axum was no longer an empire. It was a regional kingdom, and even its control of the highlands was tenuous. New centers of power emerged in other parts of Ethiopia. The Zagwe dynasty, which rose in the 11th century, established its capital at Lalibela, far to the south of Axum. These new rulers claimed legitimacy through their Christianity and through asserted connections to the Solomonic line, but they did not rule from Axum. The old capital became a backwater, a place of ghosts and memories, important only for its churches and its religious significance. The great age of Axumite power was over, ended not by a single catastrophic defeat, but by a slow accumulation of pressures that no empire, however mighty, could ultimately withstand. The decline of Axum was not a sudden collapse. It was a slow, gradual process, spanning centuries, and even as the empire faded, the culture it had created endured. The Christian faith, which had become so central to Axumite identity, survived and flourished. The church, which had been supported by the state, became the institution that held Ethiopian society together, preserving the written language, the liturgy, the sense of continuity with the past. The monasteries, which had been established in the days of the empire, continued to be centers of learning and spirituality. The Ge'ez script, which had been the language of the Axumite kings, remained the liturgical language of the Ethiopian church, used in worship and in the copying of sacred texts. In the highlands, new kingdoms rose to fill the vacuum left by Axum's decline. These kingdoms, centered in different regions, competed for power and influence. They claimed descent from the Axumite kings, asserting their legitimacy through connection to the glorious past. They preserved many of the traditions of Axum, the Christian faith, the written language, the memory of empire, and in this way, even though the political entity of Axum disappeared, its cultural legacy lived on, shaping Ethiopian identity for centuries to come. The ruins of Axum, abandoned and forgotten by the wider world, slowly became overgrown. The stone buildings crumbled, the inscriptions weathered, the stelae fell or were buried in earth and vegetation. For centuries, Axum was known only to the local people, who continued to revere the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion and to tell stories of the ancient kings. The outside world, preoccupied with its own concerns, forgot that Axum had ever existed. European travelers, when they began to explore Ethiopia in the 16th and 17th centuries, were astonished by what they found. They saw the ruins, the massive stones, the fallen stelae, and they wondered who could have built such things. Some speculated that they were the work of ancient Egyptians, or even of the Queen of Sheba, but the truth, that these were the remnants of a great African empire, was slower to be accepted. It was not until the 19th and 20th centuries that archaeologists and historians began to piece together the story of Axum. They excavated the ruins, uncovering the foundations of palaces and churches, finding coins and pottery and inscriptions. They deciphered the Ge'ez texts, reading the words of kings who had lived and died more than 1,000 years before. They traced the trade routes, documenting the connections between Axum and the wider world. And slowly, the empire that had been forgotten came back to life, not in stone and power, but in the pages of history books, in the minds of scholars, and in the renewed pride of Ethiopians who could claim descent from this remarkable civilization. Today, the ruins of Axum are a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized as one of the most important archaeological sites in Africa. The great stelae, some still standing, some toppled and broken, continue to inspire wonder. The Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion remains a pilgrimage site, drawing believers from across Ethiopia and beyond. And the story of Axum, once forgotten, is now being told again not just in Ethiopia, but around the world. The legacy of Axum is complex and multifaceted. On one level, it is a reminder of Africa's deep and often overlooked history, a history of sophisticated civilizations, of trade and culture, of writing and religion. Axum was not primitive or isolated. It was a cosmopolitan, literate, powerful state that played a significant role in the ancient world. On another level, Axum's legacy is preserved in the living culture of Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, with its ancient liturgy, its scriptures, its monasteries and festivals, is a direct descendant of the Christian Axumite state. The sense of Ethiopian identity, which is so strong and so distinctive, has its roots in the Axumite past, in the memory of empire, in the pride of having never been colonized, of having maintained independence and cultural continuity for more than 2 millennia. Axum's story is also a cautionary tale about the fragility of even the most powerful states. The empire that once dominated the Red Sea trade, that built monuments to rival Egypt, that sent fleets to Arabia and diplomats to Rome eventually fell. It fell not through a single catastrophic event, not through invasion or conquest, but through a slow accumulation of pressures, environmental, economic, political. The trade routes shifted, the climate changed, the internal cohesion weakened, and the empire fragmented. This is a pattern that has repeated throughout history, and Axum's experience reminds us that power is always temporary, that glory fades, and that even the greatest civilizations leave behind only ruins and memories. Yet there is something profoundly moving about those ruins, to stand among the fallen stelae of Axum, to touch the stone that was carved and erected by human hands so long ago, is to feel a connection across time. It is to be reminded that the people who built this city, who lived and worked and worshipped here, were not so different from us. They had hopes and fears, ambitions and dreams. They sought meaning in their lives, through trade and conquest, through faith and family, through the creation of things that would outlast them, and in a sense they succeeded. Axum is gone, but it is not forgotten. Its story, once lost, has been recovered. And as long as people continue to tell that story, to visit the ruins, to read the inscriptions, to wonder at the achievements of the past, the empire of Axum lives on, not in stone and gold, but in memory and imagination. And so, our journey through the forgotten empire of Axum comes to an end. We have walked through its capital, stood before its monuments, watched its merchants and its kings, witnessed its rise and its slow decline. We have seen how a small highland kingdom transformed itself into a great power, how it adopted a new faith and a new identity, how it reached across the sea and touched the wider world. And we have seen how in the end even the most powerful empire can fade, can be forgotten, can be reduced to ruins and legends. The story of Axum is a story of human ambition and achievement, of the desire to build something lasting, something that matters. It is also a story of loss, of the inevitable passage of time, of the way that even the grandest creations crumble and decay. But it is not a story of futility, for what Axum built, in stone and in spirit, continues to resonate. The churches still stand, the faith still thrives, the memory still inspires, and in that memory, in that continuing legacy, there is a kind of immortality. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the past. I hope you have found it illuminating, that you have glimpsed something of the richness and complexity of a civilization that deserves to be remembered. The world of Axum is distant from us in time and in many ways in culture, but it is also surprisingly close, a reminder of the common threads of human experience that bind us across the centuries. Now, as the story fades, as the images of ancient Axum dissolve back into the quiet of the night, I invite you to rest. Let the weight of history, the grandeur and the sorrow, the rise and the fall, settle gently in your mind. Let it remind you of the impermanence of all things, and also of the enduring power of human creativity and resilience. The empire of Axum has vanished, but its echoes remain. whispered on the wind that blows across the Ethiopian highlands, carved into the stones that still stand in the ancient city. Sleep well, and dream of distant ages, of kings and merchants, of trade routes and monuments, of a world that once was, and will never be again, but whose memory, fragile and precious, we carry forward into the future. Until we meet again in another corner of history, rest peacefully, and may the stories of the past bring you comfort and wonder. Good night.